مساء الخير، أهلًا
Good
بيكم
evening,
معاكِ
welcome. You have
محمد
Ahmed Ashour. I
وهتكلمينا
am
النهارده
working in ARIJ, a
بعنوان
supervisor on investigations, and this session will be covered by
قائمة
me,
الأريج
and it
ومعايا
is
سادة
about
المتحدثين
covering challenges to humanity,
المعنيين
climate, and war. We have a group of
ومشاركين
panelists who will
الموضوع اللي إحنا
provide
هنتكلم عنه
their valuable
النهارده.
visions about our
ولكن
topic
قبل ما نبدأ
today.
معاهم خلّينا
Before we
كده
start, allow me
بقواعد للجلسة
to
كالآتي.
develop my ground rules.
أعزائي
We have four
المستمعين
parts
أهلًا
in the session.
بحضراتكم
First of all, I'll give you an
مع تحدي
overview
العدالة المناخية
about the
المقرر
climate
ربما رأسنا حاجة
change manual. I'll be
عليه.
speaking about
والجزء
it.
الثاني
And
أنا
the
أحب
second part,
المتحدثين إن هم
the
يلقوا بشكل
panelists
عام عن
will talk in
آرائهم
general
حول
about the
المناخ
relation between
وكيفية
climate
الحروب
change and
الأخيرة
wars
في
from
الكلمة
different viewpoints.
ويشارك
In the
ضيوفي
third
السادة.
part,
أنا
we'll
هاشرح
take
في
questions
الجزء الرابع
and
حضراتكم
I'll
الزملاء
ask
الموجودين
the
معانا
panelists
والزملاء الموجودين
questions. And
معانا
in the
عبر الرابط
fourth
الإلكتروني أرجو إن هم
session,
يبعتوا
our
على
online
إيميلي
colleagues and
الرسائل
you
الموجودة
can
أمامكم
ask
مباشرة. اللي
questions.
محتاج الترجمة
If you
للغة
need
الأولى يا ريت
interpretation,
اللي
we
هو
have
يوصّي
headsets.
الدعم
Could you
الفني عشان
please go
نقدر
and get
نساعد
a
للترجمة. أنا
headset
هاتكلم
from the
بالعربية
technician? I'll be
والضيوف هيتكلموا
speaking in
بالعربي
Arabic. The
والإنجليزية
panelists
ما
will
عدا
speak in
محمد
English,
النوبي
except Muhammad
هيتكلم
Al-Mukhtar.
باللغة العربية. أنا يسعدني إن أنا
Muhammad Al-Mukhtar will speak in
أعلن
Arabic.
عن إطلاق دليل العدالة المناخية بعدد صارات
The
إحصائية. تم إعداد هذا الدليل
This
ضمن
manual
إطار
about
الخطة
climate
لعمل المناخ
justice
الشمولي
has been
بتعاون
prepared in
بين
collaboration
هايفس
between
انترنيوز
ARIJ, HIVES,
وآري للتدريب
Internews, and
للقيام
ARI
بجميع
to
التحديات المناخية
provide
والقضايا
full
اللي هي في
understanding for
الأردن
all of the
ولبنان
climate
وفلسطين
challenges in Jordan, Lebanon,
حاليا
Palestine, and
هنعرض
Tunisia.
فيديو
And now
هيدي
I'll
نبذة
present a
مختصرة
video
عن دليل
which will
العدالة
give you an
المناخية.
overview about the
خلينا نشاهد
manual
الفيديو مع بعض.
of climate justice. Let's watch it together.
التغير المناخي، أين العدالة في مواجهة هذا التحدي العالمي؟ دليل أريج في عام 2024 يقدم مفهوم العدالة المناخية وكيفية تناوله بأسلوب صحفي مهني عربي. الدليل مقسم إلى 7 فصول. الفصل الأول: أساسيات التغير المناخي وتأثيراته وقضايا العدالة المناخية. الفصل الثاني: الخطوات الصحفية في قضايا التغير المناخي من اختيار الفكرة إلى تحديد المصادر الموثوقة. الفصل الثالث: مفهوم صحافة الحلول وكيفية تطبيقها على قضايا العدالة المناخية. الفصل الرابع: منهجية أريج في الصحافة الاستقصائية لتغطية هذا النوع من القضايا. الفصل الخامس: منهجية تدقيق المعلومات المتعلقة بالقضايا المناخية. الفصل السادس: أدوات مفتوحة المصدر تساعد في جمع المعلومات والتحقق من الأدلة حول قضايا المناخ. وأخيراً، يختتم الدليل بفصل عن تقنيات سرد القصص عبر الوسائط المتعددة لتكون قضايا العدالة المناخية جذابة وذات تأثير. لتصفح الدليل وتحميله يمكنكم زيارة موقع أريج.
للوهلة الأولى يبدو
For
إن ما
the
فيش
first
علاقة ما
time,
بين تغير المناخ والحروب إلا
we
إن
see as
إن الكونسبت
there
ده
is no
مرتبط
relation
ارتباط
between
خاصة
war and
وبالتالي
climate change, but this is
بتؤدي
a wrong
إلى
concept because
الظاهرة وحدة
wars
التغير
could
المناخي بتسبب
increase the frequency
التغيرات
of
الجوية
climate change. It increases the
والهواء وتحصل
GHG
كوارث
gas
طبيعية
emissions. And
والنزاع
when there
بين القوى
are
المناخية
disasters and
بإجابة
catastrophes taking place in
كبيرة.
the wars,
مواجهة القوى المناخية بتكون
the
متأخرة
response
وطبعا
to the
بيتم
climate
الأمر
change
على اجتماعات
disasters
المحلية
will be
واحد
very
العلامات
slow, and
هو
this
إرسال قطاعات
exacerbates the
الفضائيين
challenges.
علشان بيغطوا مناطق
It's
اندلاع
also a
مهمة في
challenge to
القناة
the journalists
الفضائية
who are covering climate
وكمان
change
بيغطوا
or
منطقة
conflict
بتتحرك
zones.
في الوقت
And
نفسه. هنتقل حاليا
I
للمتحدثين
will
كل
be
متحدث هعرفه
asking
يعني
questions to the
التايتل
panelists.
بتاعهم
I'll
هيكون
give you their
مجرد إطلاق
titles, and
وهو
each has
بيعرض
5 minutes
الموضوع من
to
وجهة
speak
نظره.
about
المتحدث الأول أندرو
this
ليرين
topic.
مدير
Andrew
التحقيقات
Laren,
الاستقصائية في كلية
who is
الصحافة
Director of
وجامعة فيرجينيا في
Investigative
نيويورك عمل
Reporting at
دراسة
the City
المحرك
University
الأول
of New
لتغطية
York. He
الأمطار
worked
على شبكة
as a
إي بي
senior
سي
editor
والدليل
at
هو دراسة
NBC
الإجراء
and a
المباشر
senior fellow,
حاليا في
fellow
نيويورك
at
تايمز.
Butler
أهلا
Center,
بيك أندرو.
investigative reporter at New York
أندرو،
Times.
هل هناك
Hello,
علاقة
Andrew.
ما بين
Andrew, is there a relation between war and climate change? Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ahmed. Absolutely, there is a relation between war and climate change. And look, if I may start the 5-minute part, or yeah?
5 minutes,
Yeah, sure. So, there's no doubt that journalists face real risks covering the war in Gaza, Yemen, Sudan, elsewhere. And there's no doubt that there's so many important issues we have when we're covering war. And these challenges include not just covering disasters, but also making sure that these stories are heard. And that means we have to tell those stories right. When we tell those stories well, we're telling the stories of those who are often forgotten or marginalized. We know the challenges are clear covering war. In Gaza alone, we know there are well more than 150 journalists who've died covering the war in Gaza. Journalists have died covering other wars on assignment in Lebanon, Sudan, Iraq, Yemen. This is happening not just in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world. We know that even just in the war in Gaza, we know that these past 2 years have been among the worst for a war where journalists have been killed in conflict. You don't need me to tell you about all the difficulties our profession faces covering these important issues. The deaths are also signal a grim reality that it's not safe, really, for many journalists to cover these important issues. And journalists must decide whether they need to leave their homeland to cover other subjects. We face other economic challenges and changes in our industry. So there are a lot of pressures and risks for journalists. At the same time, one thing has changed that I think is important to emphasize. Unlike ever before, we have new tools that can help us cover these kinds of disasters, and particularly the environmental damage that's happening in war. We can use satellite images like never before to document war and damage to our environment. Even when officials refuse to answer questions or deny things, we can use satellite imagery to pinpoint buildings, towns, villages that have been destroyed, fields that have been destroyed, desalination plants that have been destroyed. We can use satellite imagery to do these things, and best of all, many times it's free. We just need to be skilled at using it. It's also important to know that environmental stories in general are important. Look around this room. In the back alone, with ARIJ highlighting important stories in the Middle East, I counted at least 3 stories back there that are strong environmental investigations. 2 on dams, 1 on a factory issuing pollution. These are important stories. We all know that they are vital. And the other thing to know is that even when companies or governments refuse to talk, we can also use not just satellite imagery, but other material and other evidence to document how chemicals are heating up our planet. So for instance, journalists are working with local residents to collect water samples to test for pollution. When officials say a massive real estate development or factory is not harming the environment, we now have the tools to check it out. And many of these tools are becoming easier and cheaper to use. Many of these tools did not even exist 5-10 years ago. We still need to keep interviewing people on the ground. We need to keep telling their stories and try to tell them as eloquently and as succinctly and beautifully as we can. But it is also important for us at gatherings like here at ARIJ to take the opportunity to learn new skills so that we can tell these stories more deeply. Tell them information we have verified, and make sure that at the entry level, these stories continue to be heard. And of course, ARIJ now is putting out this important guide on climate justice. But let me just tick through some interesting statistics or important statistics to know about recent conflicts and how we can use data and information to talk about these wars. In Gaza city alone, water production is nearly ruined. Most of its water wells are damaged. All of its desalination plants are damaged. These are things we can measure. Sometimes when we have difficulty getting into an area, there are indicators we can use to measure pollution. So for instance, hepatitis A can tell us about water pollution. And cholera, should it break out like it has in the wars in Yemen and Syria and in Sudan. Cholera is another indication of water pollution. There are things that we may not like to talk about: diarrhea, jaundice, other respiratory infections. These happen because of environmental pollution. And diarrhea is believed to be the second leading cause of death in children under 5 years old in Gaza right now. So environmental factors are an important thing to be measuring. Upper respiratory tract infections. When buildings blow up, it's not just the fear and damage of the buildings and the debris raining on you, it's the particle dust that lingers in the air that can cause long-term health effects, but also an indication of the air quality declining. And there are other things we can measure too. So for instance, there's been a long effort to bring back marshland in Gaza, to restore it to the pristine state that it once was. A lot of that progress is being lost. We can measure that with satellite imagery without having to be on the ground because of the risks there. And if we are able to get a reporter in that area, even better. Finally, there's other kinds of waste. There's solid waste burning in open fires because it's impossible to treat waste right now. That also means that hazardous gases and more particulates are going into the air. There's phosphoric acid from weapons that's landing in the soil, and that's also ruining agricultural lands in Gaza and elsewhere. And so munitions debris, unexploded bombs and ordnance, all of these continue to degrade land and water and air. And then finally, when it comes to gases, you can measure the amount of planet-warming gases that are being emitted because of the conflict. And that means everything from all the jet sorties, the fighter jet sorties flying over, to other ways that you can actually measure the damage that's happening in the ground, in the air, on agricultural lands, and more. So imagine my 5 minutes might be up, but thank you so much.
ثانك يو. شكرا أندي، الحقيقة رؤى قيمة جدا، وكويس ان انت يعني القيت الضوء على استخدام الادوات المصادر المفتوحه في الدليل. في فصل مخصص لادوات المصادر المفتوحه، انا بدعو حضراتكم خاصه الزملاء اللي بيشتغلوا في مناطق النزاع ان هم يقدروا يستفادوا من الادوات دي، علشان احنا بنواجه الحقيقه صعوبات مع الزملاء اللي احنا بنشتغل معاهم، اللي هم بيحاولوا
with the colleagues who are covering environmental issues in areas of conflict because they cannot work on the field, and we need to enhance their skills in the use of open sources. Those tools are available and they're free, but they need some training in order to be able to use them effectively. Now I'm gonna go to Jairus. Jairus Twindle is a journalist, a seasoned journalist who works with international platforms to cover the climate crisis. He was the director of Al Jazeera English. Jairus, you're most welcome. And you're going to show us a very important video that shows the impact of the war on Gaza. Now the war is going on and there are environmental impacts that could continue afterwards. May God protect Gaza and its people. You have 5 minutes, guys.
Mohammed. So why do we talk about climate change? People are being killed in wars around the world. In Gaza, Israel's war on Gaza has killed more than 44,000 Palestinians. We've got wars in what's going on in Lebanon, in Ukraine, in Sudan. Headline events today in Syria. Where does climate change fit into all this when you're in the newsroom? I only have a few minutes, but I want to talk about the connection between war and climate change. And I will humbly suggest that it's important for journalists, especially journalists in the Middle East, to explore and report the connection between war and climate change. So the science tells us that the Earth is heating. Actually, it's overheating. Climate change is existential. for humanity. That's all of us. It's an existential problem. The United Nations chief, Antonio Guterres, talks about how we are in the era of global boiling. So why is it important for journalists to highlight the effects of war and climate change? So beyond the terrible human suffering of war, conflict is a significant driver of climate change. And it's important for journalists to understand the connection. Why is it important for journalists, especially in the Middle East, to explore and report this connection? So the Middle East, the region, is already one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to climate change. Just to give an example, Jordan is among the world's most vulnerable to drought as a result of climate change, according to a report issued by the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. This is the United Nations body which is monitoring climate change. Of course, we know that the Middle East, unfortunately, is a region of conflict. What's happening in Palestine, in Lebanon. We've had, in the last 20 years, wars in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Sudan. God forbid we don't have anything more developing in Syria. It's a region of conflict. And I think it's important there's an intersectionality, a systemic intersectionality of issues around war and climate change. You see the same systems, the systems of expansion, extraction, exploitation, expropriation, commonalities between the fossil fuel industry and the military-industrial complex. And it's important to understand these systemic intersectionalities. And also, climate change, younger audiences are interested in climate change. We have research that we did at Al Jazeera that showed that younger generations are particularly interested in climate change. Even generations that don't necessarily engage with the news because of news avoidance, there is a great interest among younger people in climate change, and it's a way to get into other stories. I have the good fortune of assisting with ARIJ on a project in which we are looking at stories from Lebanon and Gaza. We're commissioning local journalists from Gaza and Lebanon to do short reports on the link between war and climate change. I'm going to show a video. Thank you to Rashid and Farah for helping with this. The video is going to be in Arabic, but for those non-Arabic speakers, it's only 2.5 minutes, but it was important to show it in Arabic. But it basically talks about how does war drive climate change. Firstly, you have the carbon emissions, the emissions of the fossil fuel burning. Think of all the military machines, jets, tanks, warships, planes, cargo planes, the carbon emissions that are creating this warming planet. Then you have the reconstruction, if and when there is reconstruction. Reconstruction is very carbon intensive, the cement, the concrete. Imagine the carbon cost of reconstructing Gaza or Lebanon is going to be huge, or Ukraine. Then you have the biodiversity loss, the loss of trees, which are carbon storage, and all of that carbon going out. And then the pollution from the damaged buildings, something Andrew mentioned, all the pollution which releases methane and releases greenhouse gases which heat the planet. Anyway, I'd like to just run this 2.5 minute video. So Saeed, please. very quickly, another final point. It's very important to make those connections. This is not just an environmental story. It's about making the connection from the environment problems to the climate change problems, making that connection about carbon emissions, methane, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases. Those are what are causing the heat warming. So it's not just an environmental story. And my final point before I hand over to Mohammed, covering climate now, we might talk about this, but how do we report this story? And we have a formula: humanize, localize, and solutionize. Because it's a kind of scientific story, give it a human face. Localize, although it's an international, global story, climate change is happening everywhere, even in your backyard, whichever country you're in. And solutionize, we don't want to just talk about doom and gloom. There are solutions, but we have to analyze rigorously those solutions. Some solutions are false, are fake solutions, but there are solutions to this problem, but we must act now if we're going to find a way, and it's important that journalists provide those solutions, as we did during the COVID crisis. We provided solutions about how to deal with the COVID symptoms. It's important that we do provide solutions, but they have to be rigorously tested and exposed if they're false solutions. Thank you.
شكرا جايلز. الحقيقة كمان الفيديو محزن.
Thanks. It was a very sad video because it showed that also reconstruction is going to have an environmental cost. So unfortunately, the war is going to leave its impact on human beings and the environment. Let's go to Sudan. Our colleague Mohammed Mukhtar, a journalist and a fact-checker, member of the syndicate of journalists in Sudan, and he works in combating violent extremism. You are the only one on this panel who comes from a country which is actually war-torn. Can you tell us about the relationship between war and climate change?
Yes, frankly speaking, the relation between wars and climate change is intersectional. However, we have to describe this relationship. We can say it's complicated and very confusing, and we have to track the implications of the war and climate change and the relation between them. The whole area, in my opinion, is living an unprecedented crisis, whether in Gaza, Sudan, Yemen, Libya. The whole area is living a big crisis. We have wars everywhere. In Sudan, the situation is very bad. We have an unprecedented crisis as described by international and regional actors. Sudan suffered from different wars. Also, Sudan is impacted greatly by climate change. And the climate change displaced huge communities from a desert to other areas due to the lack of precipitation, and those pastoral communities and rural communities are moving towards the cities. And in the cities, all of the infrastructure and the resources are pressured by this displacement or movement, and this will lead to more problems between both communities. And this is why I said already that the relation is very complicated. We have different reasons behind this and that, but I think that we need to highlight the relation more, understand the relation more, and try to break this vicious cycle to find the new solutions to the problems and to respond to the ramifications of the war and climate change. I have a point to mention. The wars have their own reasons, and the climate change has its own reason. And there are people who are responsible for the wars and the climate change. But who is responsible for the burdens?
ملف الدعم التقني مش حطها على جنب، يعني لو تقدر تحطها على جنب. ماشي، اتفضل.
But who is suffering from the burdens? We do believe that there are reasons behind climate change and people responsible for climate change and wars. But the local communities bear the biggest burden, whether in Sudan, the Arab world, Middle East as well. The people responsible for climate change are irresponsible, so they leave. They leave and they don't care for what they cause. In Sudan, we faced many crises, and due to the crisis in Sudan, there is a very new complex humanitarian situation. We're speaking about 14 million, 0.5 displaced only from Sudan. The number is very large, and the displacement impacts the woods, forests, environment, and the new regions. They've got displaced too. So the longer the war is, the more difficult it is to find these solutions. Until now, there are no clear solutions, and this is why the environment and the climate in general are both impacted highly to a great degree. During the war, we've seen many unsustainable practices, and all of the resources are used by the warlords. And the economy is a war economy, so there are no sustainable practices. This is a big problem during crises and wars, and the war itself, it is impacting our ecosystem, including the bombing, air attacks, tankers, and the manufacturing of weapons. Don't forget all of those points. So this complex and confusing relationship will have its future implications on the future generations. The communities are displacing today from areas with no resources to areas with resources. If they continue doing so, a big disaster will happen in the future, and all of the impacted communities will be impacted more and more communities will be affected by climate change impacts. We need interventions, including the conventions of climate change. We have to abide by all of the conventions and to ratify them. In addition to the war, we have to cease the war, otherwise our area will continue its suffering. This area faced same problems during a long time, and until now there are no accurate studies related to the impact of wars on climate or environment. Allow me also to speak about the extraction of oil and the mining in general, whether mining gold or any other metals. Mining affects the environment, and many people are migrating due to the illegal mining. The mining that happens without control, although it should be under great controls or rigorous controls. Now we have extreme weather in some areas. There was no precipitation, and now the precipitation is very high, or the temperatures. Some areas had moderate temperatures, and now the temperatures are rising greatly in those places, and there are no solutions presented. Here comes the role of the journalists in highlighting such crises. I think that the youth in general are playing a role, whether content creators or influencers. They can play a role in the information landscape. Youth should be part and parcel of our efforts, and Youth should be guided to the right direction, and they should gain information about the climate and climate changes. Even in climate change, there is misinformation and fake news, as some of the content creators and influencers have their own followers, like sometimes from 5 to 7 million influencers. So their influence is huge on others. And and they can work with us on educating people on climate change. They can be part of the efforts we try to exert in this regard. Thank you, Muhammad. Please highlight another point. You said there is an absence of studies in the area, and we need credible information in the area to depend on our reports. So it's very good that you highlighted this point, the absence of studies. Henrik.
Now, to Henrik Fine, he was the editor in the public podcast committee in Denmark. He worked as a strategic consultant to ARIJ for 15 years. Henrik, you're most welcome. You're always with us in ARIJ forums, and you always speak about the importance of climate issues and that we always should address them. You, now, the audience that we have in the areas of conflict, they also need to know more about this. So please shed the light on this topic, if you may.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm from IMS, as you said, International Media Support, and we have just finalized a strategy for conflict and environment coverage for our partners in more than 40 countries. And the reason why we have taken this up is definitely because, as it's been called, it is the biggest story of the century. I mean, you can have conflicts and you can have bankruptcy and so on, but this is a story that's actually threatening humanity. And therefore it's very important to cover, but also to do it in a way so your audiences are reacting, you have a thing that's happening afterwards, and that is very often the problem, I think, when you see when you see coverage of climate, that very little is happening, and especially when it's countries of conflict, and we are primarily working in countries of conflict or post-conflict. And when we come in with this, people think, okay, yeah, that's the environment, that will go on for many years. We have a war going on right now here, but it's really incredible important to take this up also and measure it. Because it means so much. I've taken an article now. These days we are celebrating that Syria is getting free of Assad. But I'm taking an article made by Mace Cat, who's also here, from Syria, about what the war has meant in Syria already in terms of pollution and also for climate change. And it's enormous. It's 100,000 acres of farmland that has been destroyed. And we just don't mention that because it's not right here and now. But it's a very important story. And it's also showing that it will cost at least $10 billion to re-establish now when the war is over. So there's so much work. And of course, those money will not come from the warring parties. I'm sure that's also the case from Gaza, as we were seen before. So that means, okay, we do this story, and then what? What is happening? If nothing is happening, what's it worth to come in with the story? So I think when we do these stories, we need to redefine our role. And Giles was also mentioning a little bit about it. It's not enough just to reveal these atrocity and environment crimes. What happens is that people get depressed or the audience turn away. This, what's called news avoidance, is now 37%. That means 37% of the population is today not wanting to watch news because either they think we cannot do anything about it, we get depressed, and that figure is growing year by year. So in that way, okay, we can do these stories because we find them important, but if people don't react, if people don't read them, then what? And that's why we need to come in and tell these stories in a way where people can react and see where and how. And therefore, I also think that being in an investigative equation here, it's important with investigations, but it's also important to look for the solutions, to look for how people can get engaged and also make that part of the story. I'm beginning to work in Indonesia and the Philippines now, and where we have introduced this with constructive journalism. And in this media tempo, which is the most important investigative media in Indonesia that we work with now, they came and said, okay, this is what we want to do, because people are thinking we are just these very angry people just accusing everyone of everything, and the time is not for that today. People want to see what they can do, and therefore they have changed, and it has made more people, a bigger audience, and actually also things happening. So it's like they have a lot of polluted lakes, but it's not only to show the polluted lakes, it's also to follow those who are doing something about it. But, as Giles also pointed out, it can very easy, it's very important that this is for real, it's just not just a setup, so you have to keep your critical mindset when you do it, but to go in more from on top of the investigation on a constructive view, that's what we encourage.
بالتأكيد وإحنا بنأكد على أهمية
Of
ثقافة الحلول، وهي
course,
كمان
and
موجودة في دليل
we
أريج المحدث إن
support
ثقافة
this
الحلول بقت جزء من
the
الثقافة الاستقصائية،
journalism
مش
of
بنقف بس عند
solutions. This is
الأثر،
a
كمان
part of
بنطرح الحلول.
investigative
يعني
journalism,
للأسف هي
and we
توفر
have this
قليل
in
من الوقت،
our guide.
يعني
Unfortunately,
هاخد بعض
we're
الأسئلة اللي
running out of
موجودة
time. I'm
أونلاين.
going to take some of the online
يعني سعيد
questions.
القدسي
Saeed
من اليمن
Al-Qudsi from
بيسأل سؤال:
Yemen
ما
is
هي النصائح
asking,
التي يمكن
what
تقديمها
do you
للصحفيين حول
recommend
تغطية
to
المجاعات مع
the
احترام
journalists covering
كرامة
famine,
الضحايا؟
meanwhile
أحب أسمع منك يا
respecting the
أندرو في دقيقة
dignity
واحدة،
of the
إيه هي
victims? Andrew, in a
أبرز
minute,
النصائح اللي أنت ممكن
what
تقدمها
would you
للصحفيين اللي هم ممكن
recommend
بيشتغلوا في
to
مناطق النزاعات
journalists who
مع احترام
work in
كمان كرامة
areas of
الضحايا؟
conflict while respecting the dignity of the victims?
That's such an important question.
بس في دقيقة.
And one of the,
in 1 minute.
in 1 minute,
Yeah.
yeah. So very quickly, I think the way you can respect the victims is by telling their stories, because what's happening to them is not their fault. I think you can tell their stories with grace and dignity, but it is important to get their stories out so the world can listen to what's happening with war, with conflict, and what it's doing to their environment and to their lives, and especially since the question was about starvation, about food.
تمام. في سؤال كمان أحب أوجهه.
There is another question that I would like to ask Jairus. There are areas that had conflicts in the past. Were there any procedures environmentally, given that you are an expert in the area, were there any measures taken to solve environmental problems that took place in those areas?
I mean, we can think of the destruction of the oil wells in Iraq, 2003. And actually, even in the 1990-91, the horrendous destruction of oil wells. One thing I would say here is that we've heard of genocide, but there's a campaign for a new international crime called ecocide. And the idea of ecocide is that is the wanton, deliberate destruction of the environment and making life unsustainable for people. And there is a campaign now in Europe and indeed the West to try and get ecocide to be considered by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, to get ecocide considered as like genocide, like a war crime, like a crime of aggression against humanity, to get it on the same level as an international crime. So there have been examples in the past. Of course, wars have destroyed, wars have always been destructive.
وصلت الفكرة. شكرا جدا. محمد، في كلمة واحدة، نصائحك ايه للصحفي السوداني اللي موجود دلوقتي؟
Ahmed, in one word, do you have any tips or advice to the Sudanese journalists trying to create balance between the coverage of climate change and the other humanitarian crisis? I think that the journalists in Sudan are living in a very bad circumstances. Give me one tip. My tip is, at the beginning, the journalists should focus a lot on telling the truth. The truth should not be killed like any other person in this war within all of the circumstances in Sudan. Henrik, do you have one word,
ما هي النصيحة التي توجهها
one tip,
لوسائل
one
الإعلام
advice to the international media or the general media in covering climate change in addition to wars?
In one word, I would for sure, well, humanize, like you also said, humanize the stories.
بالضبط، ده يعني محتاجين الحقيقة برضو إن إحنا يعني نسلط
Yes, we have to humanize those crises because climate change cases are humanitarian cases. Thank you, the panelists. I would like to thank the colleagues online, and let's go to the next session with Dr. Zahira Harb. What does it take to break boundaries? Thank you.